I've always been a man of the woods. My ancestors, proud members of the Lenape tribe, have roamed these lands long before the settlers claimed them as their own. I grew up hearing tales of the spirit of the forest, the whispering trees, and the watchful eyes that lingered just beyond the edge of darkness. My father, a stern but kind man, used to tell me, "The forest gives and it takes. Respect it, and it may spare you." I thought those stories were just a way to keep me out of trouble, but I would soon learn that the forest holds secrets deeper than even our oldest legends. When I accepted the job as a park ranger at the Allegheny National Forest, I viewed it as a chance to protect the land of my ancestors and continue our legacy. The forest was vast and beautiful, with dense canopies that blocked out the sky and trails that wound like veins through the wilderness. Most days were simple, guiding tourists, ensuring the trails were clear, and occasionally patrolling for poachers. But there were moments, fleeting as a breath, when the forest felt different. Something primal and ancient seemed to pulse in its depths, a silent, heavy presence that pressed on my chest the deeper I ventured. It started with a missing person report. A young woman, last seen hiking alone 3 days prior, had vanished without a trace. Her family was desperate, and I was assigned to lead the search. I've navigated the most treacherous paths in Allegheny, but that day felt different. The trees loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky. It was as if every step I took was being watched. Hours into the search, I stumbled upon something odd, a circle of stones in a small clearing, each one etched with strange, ancient symbols. They were nothing like the carvings my people used. These symbols felt wrong, like they didn't belong to this world. The air grew colder as I approached, and the wind carried whispers that prickled the back of my neck. My radio crackled with static, then died completely. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. I tried to dismiss the unease as paranoia. The forest can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone. But that night, back at the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had trespassed somewhere I wasn't meant to be. I dreamt of dark figures moving through the trees, their eyes glowing like embers. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The following days brought more disappearances, campers, hunters, even seasoned hikers who knew the forest better than anyone. Each disappearance occurred near that same clearing. I reported my findings to my supervisor, but he brushed it off as coincidence, blaming poor preparation and reckless behavior by visitors. But I knew better. Something was wrong in Allegheny. Determined to find answers, I returned to the stone circle. This time I brought offerings, tobacco, sage, and cedar. My people believe these gifts can appease spirits. I hoped it would be enough. As I approached, the wind stilled, and the forest fell silent. I placed the offerings on the stones and muttered a prayer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground trembled, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. A massive figure emerged from the darkness, a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood on 2 legs, towering over me, its body covered in matted fur, and its face a grotesque blend of human and beast. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The creature circled me, sniffing the air. Then, it spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "You should not be here." I stammered out an apology, explaining that I meant no harm. The creature tilted its head, as if considering my words. "Your people once knew the pact," it said. "The balance has been broken." I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew this was no ordinary spirit. It was old, ancient, even bound to the forest in ways I couldn't comprehend. Before I could ask more, the creature vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke. I collapsed to the ground, shaking. Whatever this thing was, it was powerful and angry. As I made my way back to the station, I realized that the forest wasn't just home to animals and trees. It was alive, and it was guarding something or someone. The first thing I did after my encounter with the creature was to seek out answers. I turned to the elders of my people, hoping they might shed light on what I had encountered. My grandmother, a frail woman with eyes that seemed to hold centuries' worth of knowledge, listened intently as I recounted the events. When I described the creature, her face went pale. "You saw the Wendigo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is a spirit born of hunger, vengeance, and imbalance. It guards the old paths, the places where the veil between worlds grows thin. Long ago, our ancestors struck a pact with it to protect these lands. But if the balance is broken, it awakens. The Wendigo. I had heard the name in stories meant to scare children into behaving. Tales of a monstrous being driven by insatiable hunger. but I never thought it could be real. My grandmother explained that the pact with the Wendigo was meant to keep the forest and its spirits in harmony. Offerings were made, rituals were performed, and the land was respected. But if the pact was neglected, if greed or disrespect tainted the forest, there would be consequences. "Something has disturbed the balance," she said gravely. "You must find out what." The weight of her words settled heavy on my shoulders. I wasn't just a park ranger anymore. I was a guardian of something far greater than myself. I decided to dig deeper into the recent disappearances. I pored over old reports, searching for patterns. What I found chilled me to the bone. Every missing person had been last seen near areas marked by ancient symbols, similar to the ones I had seen in the stone circle. I needed help, but I couldn't trust just anyone. Most people would dismiss this as superstition or worse, think I'd lost my mind. That's when I reached out to Officer Sarah Monroe, a seasoned law enforcement officer who had worked in the area for years. I'd crossed paths with her many times on patrols, and she was one of the few people I trusted. Sarah was tough, no nonsense, and fiercely intelligent. When I told her what I'd seen, she didn't laugh or roll her eyes. Instead, she leaned in closer, her expression deadly serious. "I've heard stories," she admitted. "Locals disappearing, strange sightings, stuff that doesn't make it into the official reports. I always thought it was just folklore, until now." Together, we formed a plan. We'd return to the stone circle, this time prepared with equipment, cameras, motion sensors, and protective charms my grandmother had given me. Sarah was skeptical about the charms, but she didn't argue. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew thick with tension. It felt as though the trees themselves were watching, their branches creaking in a silent warning. We reached the clearing just before dusk. The stone circle was unchanged, but the atmosphere was different, heavier, darker. We set up the equipment, each movement careful and deliberate. As night fell, an oppressive silence descended. Even the crickets had ceased their song. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Hours passed with no sign of the creature. Sarah and I took turns keeping watch, our nerves frayed. Just as fatigue began to set in, the motion sensors blared to life. Something big was moving through the trees. We grabbed our flashlights, scanning the darkness. Shadows danced between the trunks, and then there it was, the Wendigo, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. This time, it wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, gaunt, hollow-eyed people who moved with jerky, unnatural motions. I recognized some of them from the missing persons reports. They were alive, but barely. Controlled by the Wendigo, their faces were masks of pain and fear. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the clearing. The Wendigo stepped forward, its gaze burning into mine. "Balance," it growled. "The forest has been defiled. The pact is broken. Restore it, or more will suffer." I demanded to know what had broken the pact, but the Wendigo offered no clear answer. Instead, it gestured toward the stone circle. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I realized then that someone had tampered with the ancient markings, perhaps intentionally, or perhaps out of ignorance. Either way, it had unleashed a force beyond comprehension. The Wendigo and its captives melted back into the shadows, leaving us alone once more. I turned to Sarah, my mind racing. We needed to find whoever or whatever had disturbed the markings and put an end to it. If not, the disappearances would continue, and the Wendigo's wrath would only grow. Back at the ranger station, Sarah and I pored over every scrap of information we could find. We discovered records of a mining company that had attempted to drill in restricted areas of the forest years ago. The project had been shut down due to environmental concerns, or so it was claimed. But what if they had disturbed something sacred? We had to find out. The mining company's name was Black Ridge Extraction, and their history in the Allegheny National Forest was murky at best. Sarah and I dug through old records, news clippings, and environmental reports. What we found painted a troubling picture. Black Ridge had been fined multiple times for illegal drilling, disturbing protected lands, and even allegedly bribing officials to keep their operations running. The company had claimed to shut down their operations years ago, but the timing coincided too perfectly with the resurgence of the Wendigo and the disappearances. We needed to know more. I reached out to an old contact, Matthew Harris, a former employee of Black Ridge who had turned whistleblower. He was a wiry man with sunken eyes and a jittery demeanor, clearly haunted by his time with the company. We met in a dimly lit diner just outside the forest's edge. As he stirred his coffee with shaking hands, he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. They weren't just drilling for minerals, he said, glancing nervously around. They found something. What did they find? I pressed, my heart pounding. An underground chamber. It was sealed off with those strange symbols you mentioned. The executives thought it was some kind of ancient burial site, maybe valuable artifacts or resources. They didn't care about warnings. They broke the seal. A few days later, workers started disappearing. Those who came back were changed. Matthew's hands trembled as he spoke. I tried to warn them, but they silenced me. I left and never looked back. His words confirmed my worst fears. Black Ridge had disturbed something sacred, breaking the pact my ancestors had forged. The Wendigo's wrath wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoring balance to a desecrated land. But how could we repair the damage done by greed and ignorance? Sarah and I decided to return to the site of the old Black Ridge operation. It was deep within the forest, past trails that had long been abandoned. The journey was treacherous. Gnarled roots threatened to trip us at every step, and the air grew colder the closer we got. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep us away. When we finally reached the site, it was a ruin of rusted machinery and collapsed tunnels. The ground was scarred, and the trees surrounding the area were twisted and dead, their bark blackened. At the center of the site was a gaping hole, partially caved in. This had to be the chamber Matthew spoke of. As we approached, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and an unnatural stillness hung over the place. We set up protective charms around the perimeter, hoping they would offer some measure of safety. Then, we descended into the darkness. The tunnels were narrow and claustrophobic, lined with old mining equipment and debris. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols similar to those on the stones in the forest clearing. The deeper we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Shadows flickered just beyond the reach of our flashlights, and every step echoed like a drumbeat. At the heart of the chamber, we found what remained of the original seal, a massive stone slab, cracked and broken. The symbols carved into it glowed faintly, like dying embers. As I studied the markings, a cold wind swept through the tunnel, carrying with it a chorus of whispers. The Wendigo's voice echoed in my mind. Restore the balance. But how? The seal was broken, and I had no knowledge of ancient rituals powerful enough to mend it. I turned to Sarah, desperation clawing at me. We need to find a way to repair this. Suddenly, the ground shook, and a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. The Wendigo appeared, materializing from the shadows. Its eyes blazed with fury, and the air crackled with energy. It wasn't alone. Behind it were the missing people, their faces twisted in agony. They moved like marionettes, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they surrounded us. You have failed, the Wendigo growled. The defilers must pay. Wait, I shouted, stepping forward. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to stand my ground. We're trying to right this wrong. Tell us how to restore the balance. The Wendigo paused, its burning gaze fixed on me. Blood was spilled to break the seal. Blood must be offered to mend it. What kind of blood? Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. The blood of those who desecrated this place, it replied. Their greed unleashed this curse. Only their atonement can bind it once more. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Black Ridge's executives, the ones who had ordered the desecration, were the key. But tracking them down and bringing them to the forest was a near impossible task. Some had likely left the state, maybe even the country. And even if we found them, convincing them to return would be another battle entirely. Before we could respond, the Wendigo raised one massive clawed hand. The possessed people lunged toward us, their movements frantic and desperate. Sarah and I fought to hold them back, using every ounce of strength we had. I could see the pain in their eyes. They were trapped, pawns in a battle they never asked for. In the chaos, an idea struck me. If we couldn't bring the defilers here, perhaps there was another way to appease the forest spirits. An offering of our own blood, a ritual to bind ourselves to the land and take on the burden of restoration. It was risky, and there was no guarantee it would work, but it was our only chance. I shouted the plan to Sarah, and together, we prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. We cut our palms, letting our blood drip onto the broken seal, and chanted the ancient words my grandmother had taught me. The air crackled, and the symbols blazed with light. The Wendigo roared, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a blinding flash, the chamber erupted in light, and everything went silent. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold ground outside the entrance to the collapsed chamber. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt earth and something metallic, blood. My head throbbed, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back, the Wendigo, the ritual, and the blinding light. I sat up quickly, my heart racing, and saw Sarah nearby, stirring awake with a groan. The forest around us was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that pressed down on us like a weight. I glanced at my hand. The cut we'd made during the ritual had healed into a thin scar, but it burned with a dull ache. Whatever we had done, it wasn't over yet. Sarah met my gaze, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, "but something's changed." Before we could dwell on it, there was a rustling in the trees. A figure emerged, a man in a suit, his face pale and drawn. It took me a moment to recognize him. Richard Hale, the former CEO of Black Ridge Extraction. He was one of the key figures responsible for the desecration of the sacred site. But what was he doing here? He looked disoriented, his eyes darting around as if he were being hunted. "I didn't want to come," he stammered, his voice cracking. "They made me." "Who?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer. "Who made you?" Before he could answer, the ground trembled and shadows coiled around the trees. The Wendigo's presence was unmistakable. It stepped into the clearing, its massive form towering over us. But this time, its rage was focused solely on Hale. The air crackled with tension, and I realized the ritual had worked, partially. It had drawn one of the defilers back to the forest, but it wasn't enough to restore the balance. The Wendigo's fury had not been sated. Hale fell to his knees, sobbing. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know what we were doing." "Your ignorance does not absolve you," the Wendigo growled, its voice reverberating through the trees. "Balance must be restored." As it moved toward Hale, I felt a pang of pity. Yes, he was responsible for desecrating the land, but he was also a pawn in a larger game, just like the rest of us. I stepped in front of him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "There has to be another way," I pleaded. "Killing him won't fix what's broken." The Wendigo paused, its burning eyes narrowing. "The pact is sacred. Blood for blood." Sarah stepped forward, her jaw set. "If you kill him, the cycle of vengeance will never end. There has to be another way to restore the balance, something that doesn't involve more bloodshed." For a long, tense moment, the Wendigo said nothing. Then, it raised one clawed hand and pointed at the scar on my palm. "You have bound yourself to the land. You seek to protect it. If you wish to spare him, you must take on his burden." I didn't fully understand what it meant, but I nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." The Wendigo's gaze shifted to Sarah. "And you?" She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. But then she nodded firmly. "I'm in." The creature's eyes blazed brighter. "Very well. The burden of the defilers will be yours to bear. You will protect this land, guard its secrets, and ensure the balance is never broken again. Should you fail, the curse will return, and it will claim you both." With that, the Wendigo turned its attention to Hale. "You are spared for now. But know this, the forest watches. Should you or your kin trespass again, there will be no mercy." Hale nodded frantically, his face pale as a ghost. The Wendigo disappeared into the shadows, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I felt the weight of its words settle over me like a heavy cloak. Sarah and I had taken on a responsibility far greater than we ever imagined. We were now bound to the land, its protectors, and its prisoners. In the days that followed, we worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of Black Ridge's desecration. We tracked down other former executives, convincing them to help repair the damage they had caused. It wasn't easy. Many were resistant, driven by fear or greed, but the forest had a way of making its presence known. Strange occurrences, whispered warnings, and unexplained phenomena reminded them that they could not escape their past. Meanwhile, Sarah and I faced our own struggles. The bond we shared with the land grew stronger, but it came with a cost. We could feel the forest's pain, its anger, and its sorrow. When poachers entered the woods, we felt their footsteps like a violation. When trees were cut down, we felt the wounds. It was a constant reminder of our duty and the price of failure. One night, as we patrolled the forest, Sarah turned to me. "Do you ever wonder if we made the right choice?" "Every day," I admitted. "But if we hadn't, more people would have died. The forest would have become a place of darkness and death. We did what we had to do." She nodded, but her eyes were haunted. "I just hope it's enough." As we walked deeper into the woods, the wind whispered through the trees. The forest was alive, and it was watching. Our fight was far from over, but we were no longer alone. We had each other, and we had the strength of the land. The days that followed our pact with the forest were a blur of exhaustion and relentless pressure. Sarah and I committed ourselves fully to mending the damage done by Black Ridge extraction. We met with more of the former executives, using every tool at our disposal: persuasion, intimidation, and in some cases, the implicit threat of the Wendigo's wrath. Slowly, they began to cooperate, funding reforestation projects and working to clean up the scars left behind by their greed. But it was a drop in the ocean compared to what was needed. Our bond with the forest grew stronger, and with it, the toll on our bodies and minds became more apparent. I felt the pain of every tree cut down, every animal driven from its home. The forest's anger and sorrow coursed through me like a living thing. Sarah experienced it too, though she tried to hide it. We both knew that the burden we had taken on was crushing us, but we couldn't stop. If we failed, the Wendigo would return, and the cycle of vengeance would begin anew. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah and I were patrolling deep in the forest, drawn by a sense of unease that neither of us could shake. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a chorus of whispers. Shadows moved at the edges of our vision, and the air crackled with tension. Something was wrong. We pressed on, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We reached a clearing we hadn't seen before, a place where the trees stood gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. In the center of the clearing was a massive stone altar, covered in the same ancient symbols we had seen in the chamber and at the stone circle. Blood stained the surface, fresh and glistening in the moonlight. My heart sank. Someone had performed a ritual here, one that reeked of dark intent. Before we could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Richard Hale, but he was different. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a twisted smile played across his lips. "You thought you could stop this?" he sneered, his voice distorted and inhuman. "You thought you could bargain with forces beyond your understanding. Hale, what have you done?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. He laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You were so focused on mending the balance that you never considered the other side of the equation. The Wendigo is not the only power that dwells in these woods. There are older, darker things that thrive on chaos and blood." I realized with a sickening jolt that Hale had not been a mere pawn. He had willingly embraced whatever dark force he had encountered, using it to gain power. The ritual at the altar was meant to summon something even worse than the Wendigo, a force that would consume the forest and everything in it. The ground trembled, and a black mist began to seep from the cracks in the earth, coiling around the altar like living tendrils. The air grew heavy, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I could feel the forest's fear, the same fear that coursed through my veins. Whatever Hale had unleashed was beyond anything we had faced before. "We have to stop this," Sarah said, her voice tight with determination. She drew her sidearm, aiming it at Hale. "This ends now." But before she could fire, the mist surged toward us, knocking us off our feet. It wrapped around Hale, lifting him into the air. His body convulsed, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Then he screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest and made my blood run cold. When the mist released him, he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. But the entity he had summoned was far from done. The mist coalesced into a towering figure, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of shadows and nightmares. Eyes like burning coals stared down at us, and a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere spoke. "The pact is broken. All shall be consumed." I struggled to my feet, my mind racing. The Wendigo had been bound by rules, a guardian of balance, however brutal. This entity was different. It sought nothing but destruction. The forest's pain and fear surged through me, and I knew we had to act fast. "Sarah, the symbols!" I shouted, pointing to the altar. "We need to seal it again." We scrambled to the altar, carving the ancient symbols into the stone with whatever tools we had. The entity lashed out, sending waves of dark energy that tore through the ground and splintered trees. It took every ounce of strength to keep moving, to keep fighting. The bond with the forest burned within me, giving me strength I didn't know I had. I could feel the land itself lending us its power, desperate to survive. As we completed the symbols, I realized that one final act was needed, an offering just as before. But this time it required something more. It demanded a life. I looked at Sarah, and she met my gaze. We both knew what had to be done, but neither of us was willing to let the other make the sacrifice. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You have to keep fighting. Protect the forest." Before I could stop her, Sarah stepped onto the altar, her bloodied hand pressed against the symbols. Light erupted from the stone, and the entity screamed, its form unraveling. The ground shook violently, and I was thrown back. When the light faded, the mist was gone, and so was Sarah. I stumbled to the altar, my chest heavy with grief. The forest was silent once more, but it felt different, emptier. The bond one shared with the land pulsed with sorrow. Sarah had given everything to save it, and I was left to carry on alone. But as I stood there, I felt a flicker of something, hope maybe. The forest had been saved, but the fight wasn't over. There would always be forces seeking to disrupt the balance, and I would be there to stop them. For Sarah, for the land, for all who called it home. Emerging from the cavern, the weight of what we had just endured pressed down on me like a physical burden. The morning light, usually a symbol of hope, felt muted and cold. We had succeeded in sealing away the dark entity, but victory had come at a steep price. The forest around us was eerily quiet, as if mourning alongside us. The bond one shared with the land pulsed with pain and exhaustion, a reflection of the battle's toll. I glanced at the faces of those who had survived. Margaret's eyes were hollow, her shoulders slumped. Tom, one of our youngest and bravest, was gone, his life claimed by the darkness we'd fought to contain. The sight of his lifeless body, pale and still against the forest floor, was a haunting reminder of the cost of our mission. I knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on his chest. "You didn't deserve this," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We'll make sure it wasn't in vain." Margaret stepped forward, her voice wavering but strong. "We must honor him, and all who fell, by protecting this land. Their sacrifice cannot be for nothing." The survivors nodded, their expressions a mix of grief and determination. We had seen too much, lost too much, to walk away now. The bond we shared with the forest, forged in blood and sacrifice, demanded more than passive guardianship. It demanded action. Over the following days, we worked tirelessly to reinforce the protections around the sealed cavern. Margaret's knowledge of ancient symbols and rituals proved invaluable. We carved intricate wards into the stone, made offerings to the spirits, and chanted prayers to strengthen the barriers. The Wendigo's distant presence lingered, a watchful shadow in the periphery of my awareness. It was no longer an enemy, but a reminder of the fragile balance we had restored, one that could be shattered at any moment. But the forest's scars ran deeper than the physical damage. The dark energy that had been unleashed left a lingering taint. Trees withered, animals avoided the area, and the air itself felt heavy. The bond one shared with the land allowed me to feel its pain, and it was almost more than I could bear. I spent hours patrolling the perimeter, searching for any signs of further corruption or intrusion. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. The human threats were just as real. Word of our battle spread, though distorted and twisted by those who didn't understand, or didn't want to. Rumors of dark rituals and cults in the forest attracted attention from skeptics and opportunists alike. Black Ridge's influence, though weakened, was not entirely broken. They still had allies willing to exploit the forest's power for profit. We faced harassment, sabotage, and even attempts to breach the sealed cavern. One night, while patrolling, I discovered fresh tracks leading toward the protected site. My heart pounded as I followed them, my senses on high alert. The tracks ended abruptly, but the implications were clear. Someone was testing our defenses, searching for a way to exploit the land's secrets. I gathered our coalition and shared what I had found. "We can't let our guard down," I said, my voice hard. "They're waiting for any sign of weakness." Margaret placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We won't let this happen again." Despite our resolve, the strain of constant vigilance took its toll. The bond with the forest, once a source of strength, sometimes felt like a curse. I could sense every injury inflicted on the land, every intrusion, every act of disrespect. The anger and sorrow of the forest became my own, and there were moments when it nearly consumed me. I found myself standing in the darkness, fists clenched, teeth gritted, fighting to keep the rage at bay. It was during one of these moments that Margaret found me. "You can't carry this alone," she said softly. "We're all in this together." Her words reminded me that I wasn't alone. Our coalition had grown stronger, bound not just by duty but by shared experience and sacrifice. We leaned on each other, finding strength in our unity. New volunteers joined us, drawn by the stories of what we had faced. We taught them about the sacred symbols, the rituals, and the importance of balance. Together, we worked to heal the land and protect it from future threats. But the battle was far from over. One evening, As I walked the forest trails, I felt the Wendigo's presence once more. It appeared as a shadowy figure, its eyes burning like embers. "The balance is fragile," it said, its voice like the wind through the trees. "Guard it well." "I will," I promised, meeting its gaze. "We all will." The Wendigo faded into the shadows, leaving me alone with the weight of its warning. Our work would never truly be done. There would always be those who sought to disrupt the balance, driven by greed or ignorance. But we were ready. The bond we shared with the forest was both a burden and a gift, and we would use it to protect the land and honor those we had lost. Together, we would stand as guardians, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. The days following Sarah's sacrifice were some of the hardest of my life. The forest was quiet, almost as if it were grieving alongside me. The bond one had with the land was still strong, but it felt hollow now, haunted by the memory of what we had lost. I threw myself into my work, patrolling the woods day and night, determined to honor Sarah's memory and uphold the pact we had made. But I was just one person, and the weight of the responsibility threatened to crush me. The Wendigo's presence, though no longer visible, could still be felt. It lingered at the edges of my awareness, a reminder of the delicate balance that had been restored at great cost. I knew that simply maintaining the status quo wasn't enough. The forest needed more than a guardian. It needed healing, protection, and a renewed sense of purpose. It needed a community willing to stand together against the forces that sought to tear it apart. I began reaching out to the local communities, farmers, hunters, hikers, and even the descendants of Black Ridge's former employees. I shared my story with them, omitting the supernatural details that would be too hard to believe. I spoke of the importance of preserving the forest, of respecting the land that had sustained us for generations. Some were skeptical, dismissing me as a paranoid ranger with too much time on his hands. But others listened. They saw the scars left by Black Ridge's greed and the strange occurrences that had plagued the forest in recent months. Slowly, a coalition began to form. One of the first to join me was an elder from a nearby town named Margaret. With silver hair and a voice as sharp as a whip, she had spent her life advocating for environmental protection. When I told her about the desecrated land and the need for restoration, she didn't hesitate. "We've let too much go unchecked for too long," she said. "It's time we take responsibility." Margaret helped rally volunteers, organizing cleanup efforts and replanting initiatives. We worked tirelessly day after day, reforesting areas that had been scarred by Black Ridge's operations. It was grueling work, but it brought a sense of purpose back into my life. The forest responded too. Saplings took root and grew strong. Wildlife returned to areas that had been desolate, and the air itself felt lighter. But the bond one shared with the land continued to test me. I was connected to every inch of the forest, and with that connection came the weight of its pain. When poachers entered the woods, I felt their presence like a thorn in my side. When someone littered or damaged a tree, I felt the wound as if it were my own. The anger and sorrow of the forest became my own, and there were times when it threatened to consume me. One evening, as I sat by a campfire deep in the woods, the Wendigo appeared. Its form was less monstrous now, more like a shadowy guardian. I didn't flinch this time. We had come to understand each other in a twisted way. It spoke without words, projecting its thoughts into my mind. "You are not enough," it said. "The burden is too great for one." "I know," I replied, my voice raw. "But I don't know how to share it." "Teach them," it said. "Bind them to the land as you are bound. Only then will they understand." The idea terrified me. The bond one shared with the forest was a blessing and a curse, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But the Wendigo was right. If others could feel even a fraction of what I felt, they would be more willing to protect the land. They would understand its pain and beauty in a way that words could never convey. The next day, I gathered those who had committed themselves to the cause. Margaret, local farmers, hikers, and a few former Black Ridge employees who had sought redemption. I explained what needed to be done. Some were hesitant, fearful of what it might mean. But others stepped forward, willing to share the burden. The ritual was simple but powerful. We stood in a circle around the stone altar, our hands clasped, and recited the ancient words my grandmother had taught me. As we spoke, I felt the bond extend from me to each of them, a web of connection that tied us to the land and to each other. The forest, once silent, seemed to breathe with us. The bond wasn't as strong for them as it was for me, but it was enough. They could feel the forest's pulse, its needs, and its pain. In the weeks that followed, our efforts intensified. We patrolled the forest together, protecting it from those who would harm it. We taught the next generation about the importance of balance and respect. Whenever the burden grew too heavy, I turned to my newfound allies, and together we shared the weight. The forest began to heal, slowly but surely. One night, as I walked among the trees, I felt a familiar presence. The Wendigo appeared, its form more ethereal than ever. "The balance holds," it said, its voice softer. "You have done well." "It's not over," I replied. "It never will be." "True," it said, "but you are no longer alone." With that, it faded into the shadows, leaving me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The burden was still there, but it was lighter now. I knew that there would always be threats to the balance, forces of greed, ignorance, and darkness. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them, and I wasn't afraid. The forest had given me purpose, and through that purpose, I had found growth. I was no longer just a guardian. I was a leader, a protector, and a part of something far greater than myself. And as I looked out over the trees, their leaves rustling in the wind, I knew that Sarah's sacrifice had not been in vain. The forest lived on, and so did her spirit. The forest had found a semblance of peace, but beneath the surface, tension was brewing. The bond one shared with the land allowed me to sense the smallest disturbances, and lately, the unease had been growing stronger. Something was coming, a storm that threatened to undo everything we'd fought for. The Wendigo's warnings echoed in my mind. The balance holds for now. It was a fragile peace, and I knew it wouldn't last unless we were prepared. Margaret called an emergency meeting of our coalition. We gathered around the stone altar, now a symbol of our shared commitment to the forest. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I looked around the circle, I saw determination etched into every face. These people had become more than allies, they were family. "We've all felt it," Margaret began, her voice strong despite her age. "Something is stirring. The forest is uneasy." I nodded. The Wendigo's presence has faded, but the bond we share tells us that this peace is temporary. Whatever is coming, it's powerful. We need to be ready. One of the younger volunteers, a former hiker named Tom, stepped forward. "What do we do? We've already given everything to this cause. What more can we offer?" "Knowledge," I said. "Preparation. Unity." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my words. The forces that threaten the forest are not just supernatural. Greed, ignorance, and human ambition, they're still out there. Black Ridge may have been weakened, but their influence lingers. We need to understand what we're up against. Margaret spoke up again. "I've been doing some digging. Black Ridge may have officially shut down their operations here, but they've been funding smaller, shadowy groups to continue their work in secret. They want to exploit the land again, and they're willing to go to any lengths to do so." The revelation sent a ripple of anger through the group. We had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. The fight wasn't over, it had merely shifted. We needed more information, and we needed to act fast. "I know someone who might be able to help," I said, thinking of Matthew Harris, the former Black Ridge employee who had first warned us about the desecration. He risked everything to expose the truth. If anyone knows what Black Ridge is planning, it's him. The next day, I met with Matthew in a secluded part of the forest. He looked worse than before, pale, gaunt, and constantly glancing over his shoulder. Whatever shadows haunted him had only grown darker. When I explained what we'd uncovered, he nodded grimly. "They never stopped," he said, his voice low. "After the public backlash, they went underground. Smaller operations, fewer people, but just as dangerous. They're looking for something. Artifacts, energy sources, anything they can exploit. And they're willing to dig deep, no matter the cost." "Do you know where they're operating?" I asked. He hesitated, then handed me a worn map. "This is one of their sites. It's hidden, but if you follow the markers, you'll find it. Be careful. They don't play by the rules." Armed with this new information, I gathered our coalition once more. We studied the map, tracing the paths that would lead us to the hidden site. It was deep within the forest, close to one of the sacred areas we had worked so hard to protect. If Black Ridge's operatives were there, they were dangerously close to unleashing another disaster. "We need to stop them," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever they're searching for, it can't be good. We can't let them desecrate the land again." Tom clenched his fists. "I'm in. After everything we've been through, I'm not backing down." Margaret nodded. "None of us are." We spent the next few days preparing. We trained in the forest, learning to move quietly and navigate the terrain. Margaret taught us about the sacred symbols, and how to reinforce the protective wards around key areas. I shared what little I knew about the rituals and the bond we shared with the land. Each of us carried protective charms, and we made offerings at the stone altar, seeking the forest's guidance and strength. As night fell on the eve of our mission, I stood alone at the altar, the weight of our task pressing down on me. I could feel the forest's anxiety, a restless energy that crackled through the air. The Wendigo's presence was faint, but it was there, watching. I closed my eyes and spoke out loud. "We're ready," I said, more to myself than anyone or anything else. "We'll protect this land. We won't let it fall." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that almost felt like a response. I took it as a sign. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. The forest had given us strength, and we would use it to fight, not just for ourselves, but for every living thing that called this land home. When dawn broke, we set out, our resolve stronger than ever. We moved as one, a group bound by purpose and sacrifice. The path ahead was dangerous, but we were ready to face whatever darkness awaited. We had to be. The fate of the forest depended on it. The forest was alive with tension as we made our way toward the hidden Black Ridge site. The air felt heavy, charged with a sense of impending confrontation. Our footsteps were silent, each of us moving with purpose and determination. The bond one shared with the land made every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig feel amplified, as if the forest itself was on edge, bracing for what was to come. We followed the markers on the worn map Matthew had given me, navigating through dense underbrush and over rocky terrain. The deeper we went, the more I felt the forest's anxiety. It was as if the land itself knew that something terrible was about to happen. We reached a narrow ravine, and there, hidden behind a wall of tangled vines, was the entrance to an underground cavern. This was it, the heart of Black Ridge's secret operation. I signaled for everyone to stop. "This is where they're working," I whispered. "Stay alert. We don't know what we're walking into." Tom, ever brave, nodded. "We're with you." With weapons drawn and protective charms in hand, we slipped through the entrance. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the metallic scent of earth and stone. The cavern opened into a wide chamber, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. Machinery hummed and clanked, and at the center of it all, a group of Black Ridge operatives worked frantically. They were excavating something, an ancient artifact covered in intricate symbols that pulsed with a sickly, greenish light. Margaret's eyes widened. "That's a binding stone," she whispered. "It's meant to seal away dark forces." "They're trying to unseal it," I realized, my stomach twisting. "Whatever's trapped there, they're trying to unleash it." Before we could act, one of the operatives spotted us and shouted an alarm. Chaos erupted. The cavern filled with the sounds of clashing metal, shouted orders, and the hum of machinery grinding to a halt. We charged forward, determined to stop whatever ritual they were performing. I felt the forest's energy surge through me, lending me strength and clarity. This was what we had prepared for. I reached the artifact first, ducking under a swinging arm and knocking aside an operative who tried to block my path. Up close, the stone's light was blinding, and I could feel its power thrumming beneath my fingertips. It was ancient and alive, vibrating with dark energy. If the operative succeeded in unsealing it, the consequences would be catastrophic. Margaret and Tom joined me, fending off attackers as I tried to decipher the symbols on the stone. "We need to reverse whatever they've done," I shouted over the noise. "Seal it again." Margaret nodded, her hands steady despite the chaos. "We need to draw the binding symbols and offer a sacrifice, a piece of ourselves." As we worked, the ground shook and a crack of darkness split the air. From it emerged a form that defied description, a mass of shadows and tendrils, eyes like burning coals. The entity that Black Ridge sought to unleash was free, and its presence was suffocating. It radiated malice and hunger, feeding off the fear and chaos around it. "Protect the stone," I yelled, my voice raw with urgency. The entity lashed out, tendrils of darkness striking at anything in its path. One of our volunteers was caught, their scream cut short as they were pulled into the void. I fought to keep my focus, carving the binding symbols into the stone with a knife. The forest's energy surged within me, but it was a battle I was losing. This thing was too powerful, too ancient. It slipped through our grasp like smoke. Sarah's memory burned bright in my mind. I couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. Drawing on every ounce of strength I had left, I pressed my bloodied hand against the stone, letting the symbols glow with renewed intensity. The entity shrieked, its form flickering as the binding magic took hold. But it wasn't enough. It was too strong, too entrenched in the darkness that had seeped into the land. Then Margaret stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "Together," she said, placing her hand over mine. One by one, the others joined us, their hands pressed against the stone, their energy flowing into the binding symbols. The connection between us and the forest grew stronger, a web of light and life that pushed back against the darkness. The entity roared, its form unraveling as the binding magic tightened around it. I could feel its rage, its desperation to break free. But we held firm, our collective will stronger than its malice. The light from the binding stone blazed brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. When the light faded, the cavern was silent. The entity was gone, sealed away once more. The stone lay dormant, its symbols dim but intact. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion. Around me, the others were similarly drained, but we were alive. We had done it. We had stopped the darkness. But the cost was high. Several of our group had fallen, their sacrifice etched into the stone and into our hearts. I felt their loss like a wound, but I also felt the forest's gratitude, a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves and carried the scent of renewal. Margaret helped me to my feet. "It's over," she said, her voice soft but strong. "For now," I replied, my eyes on the stone. "But the balance is fragile. We have to keep fighting." She nodded. "We will." As we emerged from the cavern, dawn was breaking over the forest. The light of a new day washed over us, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. We had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, not as individuals, but as a united force. The forest would heal, and we would be its guardians, ready to protect it from whatever came next. The morning sun filtered through the trees as we emerged from the cavern, its light chasing away the last remnants of darkness. The fresh air was a stark contrast to the oppressive weight of the underground chamber, and for a moment, I simply stood there, breathing it in. The bond one shared with the forest pulsed gently, a reminder of the life we had saved and the sacrifices that had been made. We had won, but the victory was bittersweet. Margaret and I led the survivors back to the stone altar. There, we honored those we had lost, each name etched into our memories like sacred carvings. We spoke of their courage, their dedication to the land, and their willingness to fight for something greater than themselves. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The forest, too, seemed to mourn with us, the wind sighing through the trees like a lament. In the days that followed, we worked tirelessly to restore the areas affected by Black Ridge's operations. The binding stone remained hidden, protected by layers of wards and symbols. We reinforced the sacred sites, teaching new volunteers about their importance and the dangers of disturbing the balance. The bond we shared with the land grew stronger, connecting us in ways I never thought possible. We were more than just guardians. We were stewards of the forest's soul. But the weight of the bond was still heavy. I often found myself wandering alone, feeling the forest's pain and joy as if they were my own. The memories of what we had faced haunted my dreams. Sarah's sacrifice, the darkness we had sealed away, and the entity's chilling promise of chaos. I knew that our work was far from over. The balance was fragile, and the forces that sought to disrupt it would never truly disappear. One evening, as I walked along a quiet trail, I felt a familiar presence. The Wendigo appeared, silent and watchful. Its form was less monstrous now, almost ethereal, like a shadow at dusk. We regarded each other for a long moment, and I felt no fear, only understanding. The Wendigo was a guardian, bound to the land just as I was. We were different, but our purpose was the same. "You have done well," it said, its voice like the rustling of leaves. "The balance holds for now." I nodded. "I know, and I'll keep fighting." The Wendigo's eyes glowed softly. "You are not alone. The land remembers those who serve it." With that, it faded into the trees, leaving me with a renewed sense of purpose. I turned back toward the camp, where Margaret and the others were waiting. We had faced the darkness together, and together, we would continue to protect the land. As I walked, the forest came alive around me. Birds sang, leaves rustled, and the wind carried the scent of new growth. Life continued, fragile and resilient. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, but I also knew that we were ready. The forest had given us strength, and in return, we would be its guardians, its stewards, and its protectors. For Sarah, for those we had lost, for the land that connected us all. Years later, I stood at the edge of the forest, watching the sun set behind the towering trees. Our coalition had grown, with new generations learning to protect and respect the land. The scars of the past remained, but so did the strength born from our struggle. I felt the gentle pulse of the bond, a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made and the balance we fought to maintain. The forest was alive, resilient, and I was its guardian. As the wind whispered through the leaves, I felt Sarah's presence, a promise that we would never be alone. If you found this story of resilience, sacrifice, and the fight to protect what matters deeply moving, consider reflecting on the ways we can all become guardians of our own environments. Share this story with others to spread awareness of how every action we take can impact the balance of nature. Join the conversation, leave a comment with your thoughts, and tell us how you've been inspired to make a difference. Together, we can be stewards of the land and protect the world we call home. Don't forget to explore more stories of courage and mystery. Click to continue the journey.